Part 1, Chapter 1. Come on, Reef. Let her fly. Yeah, man. Toss her. Reef felt the weight in his hand. Hefted it. Saw in his mind's eye the smooth arc it would make when he launched it out over the busy highway below them. Saw, as well, the ripple of expressions on the faces of the drivers, who would react first with startled surprise, then fear, then anger. He knew that tangle of emotions as well, the sudden transformation from shock to stormy outrage that left you weak and hollow inside, like those Halloween pumpkins that little kids still carved. He and the others had stolen pumpkins last October and thrown them off the Everett Street overpass. He remembered the orange explosions they'd made as they hit the highway, the slash of meaty pulp crashed and dragged along by sliding, squealing tires. He grinned, leaned back, wound up for the throw. Jink grabbed his shoulder a split second before his arm shot forward. Cool it, Reef. Yeah, hissed Bigger. Cops. A white Metro Police car pulled out of Carver Avenue and cruised down Bergman on a course that would take it under the Park Street overpass on which they stood. They waited motionless, watching the white car move towards them, then flash its turn signal and pull over to the curb. They could see the patrolman behind the wheel take a microphone from the dash, hold it to his mouth, and begin talking, all the while looking up at the three teenagers standing by the metal railing that kept vehicles and pedestrians from falling into the traffic below. Reef swore. Pocketing the rock in his leather jacket, he muttered, "Be another one. Long in a minute. Let's get out of here." He and the others cut across to the other side of the overpass where the cop couldn't see them, then lopped northward up Park Street. From below, the cop wouldn't know which direction they'd gone, or even if they'd left the overpass at all, but they kept jogging anyway, till they'd made it to Patterson, cutting through the empty lot between Fishman's Mini Mart and yet another used CD store. This one didn't even have a sign up yet. Not that it mattered, it wouldn't last any longer than the one before it. By the time they got to the pit, they'd slowed to a walk, sharing swallows from the bottle they'd snagged earlier off a bum on Wickham. Bigger had been worried they'd catch some kind of disease, but Reef and Jink had laughed at him, called him an old woman, shamed him into taking the first gulp. The rum had burned their throats, but it took the edge off their rancor and put, as Reef's grandmother used to say, a bit of glitter on what otherwise had been a lousy day. For a moment, Reef could almost hear her voice in his head. Coming from a woman who'd never swallowed a drop of alcohol in her life, those words have always been funny. He tried now to think of the last time he'd seen Nan alive, but the image of her lying in the cheapest casket Pearl's funeral home offered eclipsed his other memories of her. She'd been wearing the black dress she had bought 2 years earlier at Zeller's, the only dress he'd ever seen her buy new. Even at 70% off on the final clearance rack, it had been an extravagance, but she'd needed something to wear to her husband's funeral. He remembered how Nan had wept quietly all through the service. Reef had just been glad to see the son of a bee laid out. He drained the bottle, then drove it into the alley between the pit and Wade's laundry. Miraculously, it bounced twice before shattering, the combination of sounds boomeranging between the brick buildings. No one came out to investigate. Lou Wade had learned the hard way that it was bad for business to worry about what went on in the abandoned building next door, that fires had a habit of starting next to his laundry's ventilation stack after the police showed up at the pit. Owners of the few other remaining businesses on the street knew too. Knew that the decaying eyesore once known as the Patterson Hotel was off limits to prying eyes and wagging tongues. No one called the police anymore, and the few times they came by on their own, they just flashed their light and doo-wopped the siren a couple of times to scare the kids off. Not that it worked, but it allowed everyone to pretend it did. They sidestepped a mangled grocery cart, a rusted hubcap, the remains of a child's stroller, and climbed the crumbling stone steps to what had once been the main entrance of the hotel. Gone were the ornately carved double doors and leaded glass windows that had adorned the original threshold. In their place were battered graffiti-covered sheets of plywood nailed over the entryway, and similar sheets covered most of the basement and first-floor windows. To discourage people even further, someone had spray-painted, "Danger, keep out," in fluorescent orange letters across the plywood that blocked the doorway. But some joker had altered it, so now it read, "Danger, keep partying." It was clear from the broken bottles littering the steps that the hotel's newest tenants were following his instruction to the letter. It was also clear that the city maintenance workers had given up the notion of ever keeping the building steps and walkway clear of debris, resigning themselves instead to the task of keeping it from overflowing into the street. His head now fuzzy from the rum, Reef stumbled as he climbed the steps, banging his knee on the worn stone and cursing. Bigger began to laugh, but Jink shot him a look that shut him up, and he coughed twice instead. At the top of the steps, Reef tugged at the bottom left corner of the "Keep Partying" plywood, easing it far enough away from the door frame to allow Bigger and Jink to slip inside. They, in turn, pushed against it from the inside, enabling Reef to enter easily. There was a time, Reef remembered, when they used to climb the rickety fire escape and crawl through one of the second-floor windows at the back. Now it didn't matter who saw them. The pit was theirs. Bigger belched, the sound a long, hollow gargle that seemed to come from his toes. "Gotta take a leak," he said. "So do I," offered Jink. Reef's back teeth were floating too, and all three turned toward the rear of the building. Although the plywood on the windows darkened the first floor, they made their way easily through the gloom. They knew the pit so well they could find their way through it blindfolded, and they had one afternoon when they'd all been bored. Lately, the hotel had really begun to show its age. Huge chunks of plaster, weakened from rain that seeped through the roof and blew through paneless upper windows, had begun to let go. The latest, the size of a small driveway, had fallen on the second floor the week before last. Zeus Williams had been lying under it when it came down, but he'd been so stoned he hadn't realized what had happened till he regained consciousness in the hospital. The paramedics who'd pulled him out said it would have killed a normal person, but Zeus, who'd never wasted time worrying about being normal, just laughed. The city, of course, reacted true to form. Within hours, a building inspector had tacked up 4 additional "This site condemned" signs, one on each side of the building. They didn't last long, though. In fact, Bigger stuck one on the end of Zeus's emergency room bed that same day. The nurses weren't amused, but Reef and Jink laughed like hyenas until security came and escorted all 3 of them out. The pit was built on a hill that sloped down towards the harbor, so the rear of the building's first floor hung a story above an alleyway even narrower than the one that ran alongside the building. In the days of the hotel's operation, this alley, barely wide enough to accommodate a dumpster, had served only to park delivery vehicles and to dispose of garbage. The only first-floor rooms with windows facing the rear had probably been used as offices. No paying customer would have appreciated that view. One of the first-floor windows lacked its customary plywood curtain, and it was toward this window that Reef, Jink, and Bigger headed. Standing in front of it, they unzipped their jeans and relieved themselves, sending 3 yellow arcs into the alley. "Yes," Bigger yelled. Months ago, some clown had painted a crude target on the asphalt below, and Bigger invariably scored a bullseye. Today was no exception. Reef and Jink grinned. Bigger sure had the height advantage when it came to trajectory. They'd long ago accepted the fact that their huge friend was stronger and more agile than they were. Than anyone they knew, in fact, including Bigger's own brother, Kirk. 3 years older and recently laid off from his shipyards, Kirk Ellis was a massive guy who could bench press 250 pounds without breaking a sweat. But even he was dwarfed by Bigger, and people had referred to the younger Ellis brother as the bigger one, for so long that a few of them used his real name, Bobby. Bigger suited him better anyway. When they'd finished and zipped up, Reef patted his jacket for his smokes and lighter, and his fingers found the rock he hadn't thrown. Annoyance at having been interrupted by the police flickered through him. He hated seeing a good rock go to waste. He pulled a pack of Rothmans from his other pocket and tapped out a cigarette, then offered one each to his friends. All 3 lit up, then made their way to the staircase behind the lobby, Reef in the lead. No one else was in the pit, which wasn't unusual. The warm June day wasn't forcing anyone inside, and it was far too early for a crack party. Later, though, the place would be jumping. Their footsteps echoed hollowly as they climbed the stairs. Bypassing the lower floors, They stepped out of the 5th-floor landing and crossed to the west-facing rooms at the front of the building. The afternoon sun pierced the interior shadows, flooding what had once been the presidential suite with yellow light. This was Reef's favorite place. 2 stories above the surrounding flat rooftops, the presidential suite on sunny days made him feel like he was standing on a huge stage, washed by spotlights, the city stretching before him like an expectant audience. Avoiding pigeon droppings, he sat down on the foot-wide window ledge and leaned back against the rotted casing. The breeze blowing through the glassless opening felt good on his rum-warmed face. If he wanted to, he could close his eyes and pretend he was standing with Nan on Citadel Hill, the sun on their faces as they watched tourists from as far away as California enter the fortress. But he didn't. He'd been 9 the last time he was there. Before Nan's cancer had got so bad, social services had taken him away from her, put him in a foster home, the first of many. Reef frowned. Bending down, he picked up a fist-sized fragment of window pane and held it up to his face, looking for evidence of the frightened 9-year-old in his reflection. Instead, the pitted glass mirrored the face of a defiant young man whose dark eyes had stared down more than a few social workers, even principal or 2. The glass also reflected someone who was used to getting appreciative glances from the females he encountered. Curly black hair, accentuated tan skin, and contrasted dramatically with white even teeth. His straight nose and square beard stubbled jaw made him look older than his 17 years, and his tall, tightly muscled frame only heightened that impression. For the briefest moment, he wondered whether Nan would recognize him now, and then he opened his fingers. The fragment shattered as it hit the floor. "Scar meeting us here?" asked Bigger. Reef turned to him, shook his head. Her old man's back. Jink pinched one nostril and flew fiercely through the other, sending a green scab-like projectile into the street below. "Probably got her running all over the city," he said, before reversing nostrils and blowing again. Twice. Nothing. "Better than standing around waiting for a hand upside her head," Bigger offered. Reef nodded. He used to think it was Scar's red head that set her father off, like waving a flag in front of a bull. Neither of her parents had hair that color, nor did anyone else in their family. It was her father who had named her Scarlet. Reef had seen a picture of Scar taken when she was only a few days old, and even then, her hair had been the color that usually earns kids nicknames like Carrot Top or Red. Of course, no one called Scar those names, not more than once anyway. Bigger sat on the ledge beside Reef, yawned, scratched his armpit. "Geez, I'm hungry." Jink chuckled. "You were born hungry." "Ain't as bad as being born ugly," Bigger replied. "Least I get full from time to time. You're always gonna be ugly." Jink grinned, 3 missing teeth like darkened doorways in his mouth. Along with his broken nose, the hole in his smile were souvenirs of several confrontations that had earned him a reputation as a formidable fighter. Not that these features made him any less attractive than he would have been without them. His too-wide face and slopping forehead made him look menacing even in mid-grin, an impression further emphasized by a tattooed snake that curled around his thick neck and buried its fangs below his right ear. Reef couldn't remember the last time Jink had lost a brow. Couldn't, in fact, even imagine it happening. Although not as massive as Bigger or as razor-quick as Reef, Jink had pitbull tensity and a wild-eyed demeanor that, combined the chip on his shoulder a mile wide, made people turn and cross the street if they saw him coming. Even his teachers were afraid of him. Except Mrs. Gregory, who taught Jink and Reef 8th grade English 3 years ago. Reef had just changed foster families again, which had meant another change of schools, which in turn had made him the new kid in Mrs. Gregory's class. But it hadn't taken Reef long to realize that Stan Einzer, the crazy kid with wild eyes, was on a collision course with anyone foolish enough to get in his way. The old woman stared him down time after time, never flinching, even the day Stan completely lost it and threw his chair across the room. It had been a lazy last period and the teacher had split the class in half, offering as a reward no homework to the team that could spell the most words correctly. Stan spelled about as well as he did math, which he failed regularly. In fact, Reef learned that Stan had failed almost everything once, and the only reason he'd made it to grade 8 was the school board's rule about no one repeating a junior grade more than once. Stan was as Reef had overheard a teacher comment on the 2-year plan. It wouldn't have mattered if he stayed home during the even years of his education. He was guaranteed a pass for social reasons. Reef had realized on his first day something that everyone else at the school had known for years. Stan hated school, but he hated teachers even more. He especially hated when they singled him out, forced him to demonstrate his ineptness to everyone in the room, and teachers soon learned it was better for everyone involved not to call on Stan Eisner. Mrs. Gregory, however, was the exception. All of the 5 feet tall, maybe 94 pounds soaking wet, and prone to putting a blue rinse in her graying hair, Mrs. Gregory was intimidated by no one. So when the next person in line to spell jinx was Stan Eisner, she refused to back down as he glared at her, muttering about friggin' teachers and school being a bunch of bull. She waited for Stan to risk being wrong and take a chance on being right for a change, while the rest of the students in the room held their breath. Finally, his face black with muted rage, Stan attempted the spelling, spitting the letters one at a time through his clenched teeth. J-I-N-K-S. The tension in the classroom was mattress thick, and someone at the back, longing for release, gulped. That sound, like 2 ripe pear being squeezed in a fist, was too loud for the room. The word isn't a plural form, Mrs. Gregory explained. You don't say 1 jink, 2 jinks. Suddenly, someone giggled, then someone else, then laughter erupted all around them. Humiliated, Stan rose to his feet. I can goddamn say jink if I want to, he roared. Jink, jink, jink. For effect, he kicked his desk, sending it clackling into the one in front of it. Sit down, Stanley. I ain't sittin', he bellowed. I said sit down. In response, Stan Eisner picked up his chair and threw it against the wall behind him, narrowly missing Eddie Blake, who sat in the last seat of the adjacent row. The whole class jerked around, staring in awe, as the chair, one leg bent at a crazy angle, crashed to the floor. Sitting 2 rows over, Reef grinned. This was infinitely better than the hoedown he'd given Michelle had during phys ed, her face crimson as she yanked her gym shorts back up over her bare behind. Jink, he crooned. Then he repeated it, louder, jink. Students around him grinned, and a few were even brave enough to take up the chant, jink, 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 jink. That'll be enough, Mrs. Gregory's voice, an ice pick in their throats. Then, Stanley, the chair. Stan stared at her long moment, then hissed, bite me, B. Sauntered past her out the door. Of course, he'd been suspended for the remainder of the school year, but since that was his second time in grade 8, he'd gone on to 9 the following September anyway. In the process, he'd acquired a nickname he'd worn proudly ever since. What's going on down there? Bigger asked. He pointed to a green truck that pulled up in front of the pit, the lettering on its side impossible to read from where they sat. 2 men got out and stood looking up at the crumbling facade, talking and making notes on clipboards. Then they turned their attention to their buildings on either side of the pit. One man pulled something out of his pocket and moved over to the alley between the hotel and Wade's laundry. And the something turned out to be a retractable tape that he used to measure the width of the alley. More information that ended up on the clipboard. The other man returned to the truck and started it, then drove it into the alley and out of view. More Bolden inspectors? Jink asked. Reef shrugged, his rum buzz gone. Maybe, I don't know, let's check it out. They made their way back down the stairs, pausing twice to peer into the alley. There was no sign of men. Narcs? Vicker suggested. Reef shook his head. Don't think so. They were paying more attention to the Bolden than what's inside. Reef had had run-ins with the undercover narcotics officers before. These 2 didn't seem the type. Their busyness looked real. They reached the first floor and made their way to the entrance, where Jink eased his shoulder against the plywood, allowing Reef to peer through the upside-down V between the plywood and the doorframe. Surveying the street for the 2 men, he saw no one, then pushed through the opening into sunlight. "Oh, Christ," he moaned. Almost simultaneously, the 2 called cops. Reef slumped back against a crumbling wall. I wish. Bigger and Jink eased out onto the step beside Reef. turned in the direction he was staring. This time, their voices were exactly simultaneously F.